this was never a hopeless choice between either doing nothing and allowing this problem to fester or turning Iran into Pennsylvania. That's fatuous framing by people who are still waiting for democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan. A U.S. victory in Iran that can neither threaten the region or military bases or reconstitute their nuclear program, if all of that is achieved, that will be a victory. And if we're not already there, we will be soon. And that's the angle. Here with us exclusively is Mike Waltz, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I want to play for you what your Iranian counterpart said this afternoon at the UN. Watch.
Iran does not seek war. Iran does not seek escalation, but Iran will not surrender its sovereignty. The issue before the international community is clear. Can a powerful state attack another sovereign member of the United Nations with impunity? If the answer is yes, then the charter is meaningless.
Mr. Ambassador, Iran said it will not surrender its sovereignty. Does the U.S. take that as a threat? And if so, what is the response?
Well, Laura, that's the same guy who told me I better be polite at the last UN Security Council meeting, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's asking for asylum soon, representing a regime that has terrorized the region and massacred tens of thousands of their own people. Look, I want to address your point about this talk of endless war, as Secretary Hegseth did. This is the ultimate endless war. It's been a 47-year endless war, starting with Jimmy Carter, and President Trump is taking the bold action to end it. For all of those worried about us getting pulled into the Middle East, it's actually Iran, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, we can go down the list, the Assad regime, and their instability and their terrorism that constantly pulled us in. Again, President Trump is taking the bold action to end it. He's not going to wait until they have a nuclear weapon. He's not going to wait until they have an ICBM that can hit the United States. They're rebuilding their nuclear capability. They're rebuilding their ability to overwhelm any air defenses, whether it's Israel, any of our neighbors in the region, or any of our bases with tens of thousands of ballistic missiles. He's not going to wait until this radical regime is at that point. He's taking decisive action ahead of time, and the American people are far safer for it.
There's some, to some people who have been watching closely and listening, they take it as mixed messages, right? Because you heard from Ted Cruz at Face the Nation. He said he didn't see any clear evidence that Iran was close to striking the United States or U.S. interests, or on the cusp of having its nuclear program rebuilt. Essentially, that's what he said. So what was the imminent threat that the president referenced on Saturday?
Number one, they kept their highly enriched uranium and was hiding it. And it is within weeks, a month at a most, that you can take 60% to 90% and to have a bomb. We also know that they are developing a long-range, an ICBM essentially, in addition to quadrupling the amount of missiles, shorter range and medium range missiles that they can build per month to overwhelm our air defenses. But Laura, at the end of the day, it's President Trump that has been consistent. There's a lot of people chattering out there. In all three of his campaigns, he said very clearly, Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. He gave diplomacy a chance. Both our special envoys, Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, and Kushner, gave diplomacy a chance, and it became very clear very quickly that once again Iran was trying to buy time. And here's the thing that 77 million Americans voted for. They voted for a president who keeps to his word, who keeps to red lines, and doesn't get taken advantage of with bad deals like Obama did and like Biden did. That's what America voted for, and that's what they're getting in President Trump.
Were you saying that you believe they were weeks away from nuclear weapons capability?
What I'm saying, Laura, is Operation Midnight Hammer, and the president and the administration's been very clear on this, including Secretary Rubio, obliterated their enrichment their enrichment capability. But we also knew they hid a lot of their highly enriched uranium. And part of what we were demanding as part of these negotiations were for them to ship it out of the country or get rid of it. And that's one of the things, amongst others, that they refused to do.
The issue of regime change, which I addressed in the Angle, obviously the president campaigned for more than a decade, both as a private citizen and running for office, that he was against regime change. So is the objective here what we had initially thought is to totally decimate their nuclear capability? They can't sponsor terrorism around the world. Is that victory here, or is victory putting in a new, more Western type government along with that?
Laura, the president laid it out. The Secretary Rubio has laid it out. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. They have to give up their long-range ballistic missiles. They cannot continue to sponsor terrorism all over the world, as what many administrations have put up with as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. And they can't have these naval capabilities that can instantly shut off 20% of the world's energy supply. Those are the objectives, and God bless our United States military that are achieving those objectives right now as we speak. Like you said, in many ways, we've already won. And decapitating the leadership that can pull the trigger on many of those things, on all of those things, was a key objective. Now, if the Iranian people take matters into their own hands and get rid of this diabolical regime, then I think that will be applauded around the world.
The president did tell the Washington Post that freedom for the Iranian people was also something that, he hoped for. I think we'll put the quote up on the screen. So, again, as you just laid out, that's a military objective. But he said freedom for Iran is the goal of a major military operation in an interview that the Washington Post referenced. Said, all I want is freedom for the people. Again, that was at 4 a.m, but that sounds a lot like regime change, does it not?
Well, I think if regime change ultimately is a result of this, and we have freedom for the Iranian people, as the president said, that will be celebrated by us. It's being celebrated right now around the world. But in terms of our military objectives, no nukes, no long-range ballistic missiles, naval assets, and their nonstop support to terrorism that have been killing Americans for 47 years, starting in 1979 with the Iranian embassy hostage taking. I have fellow veterans, as the president visited many times and has spoken to, that are missing arms and limbs and loved ones at the hands of the Iranians, and who, oh, by the way, were plotting and planning to assassinate President Trump himself. So for those out there that say this isn't a threat, what more of a threat do they need to see? The difference is you have President Trump that had the courage to finally deal with it and not kick the can down the road.
I actually think they're humiliated because Trump was the one who did it. And, they've been talking and talking and talking about the Iranian threat for decades.
Both Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But the Democrats making this like, well, they saw what Obama did. They saw what Biden did. Both were utter failures. President Trump comes along, takes his chance, takes his shot at this. My question to you, I guess now, Mr. Ambassador, is the president's never going to rule out options. That's not what he does. He's not going to have timelines. That would be ridiculous. That takes the heat off whatever's left of the regime or the next regime. But given what you just outlined, why would we ever need boots on the ground? We have such superior air capacity. We've already knocked out their Navy. American troops on the ground, that would seem unnecessary at this point.
Look, you're absolutely right. President Trump is never going to take options off the table. Again, unlike his predecessor, who told the world, including our adversaries, over and over again, what he wasn't going to do. But I think the bigger point, which you nailed it, is that this President Trump, isn't about admiring the problem, hand-wringing. I sit here at the UN where everyone's kind of clutching their pearls with breathless speeches. He's about solving these problems. on his watch, not handing it over to the next generation. And to that point, you had the First Lady today, Melania Trump, as the First Lady presiding over the Security Council, talking about education, actually the lack of education that often leads to radicalization, and looking over the horizon, and that an educated populace, especially with new technologies, leads to peace. This is a family of peace. President Trump is dealing with it now. We had the First Lady today looking in a visionary way, looking over the horizon about how we handle that for the next and present peace for the next generation.
You know, the Persians were among the most educated people on the face of the planet, so they understand they understood what it was like to have an educated class. Mr. Ambassador, we thank you very much, and we pray for our troops every night. Thank you so much.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.